I started the hike on a late summer morning, the kind of day where the air feels heavy even before the sun rises fully above the trees. The trail I had chosen wasn't well known. It was an old fire road that twisted into the forest before turning into a faint path marked only by fading blazes on the trunks of scattered trees. I had read about it in a small hiking forum, buried in a post that mentioned it hadn't been maintained in years. That was part of the appeal for me. I wanted something quiet, something that would feel more like real wilderness than a popular hiking route where every mile brought you face to face with other people. I packed light but careful. A backpack with water, some food, a headlamp, a knife, a first aid kit, and a small tarp rolled tight just in case weather turned. I also carried a map I had printed from an old forestry site, though the lines were thin and some trails looked like they might no longer exist. I was used to hiking alone, so I thought I had prepared enough. The first stretch was simple. Gravel crunched under my boots as the road angled upward, passing through tall grass and bushes that reached almost to my waist. The air was still damp from the night before, and each step brushed water from the leaves onto my pants. I could hear the hum of insects starting to build with the heat of the morning, and far away a woodpecker tapped rhythmically against a tree. After about an hour, the road narrowed and the forest closed in. Tall pines rose in every direction, their trunks long and straight like pillars, cutting off the view of the sky. The sunlight filtered through in broken beams that shifted with the wind. I noticed fewer signs of people the deeper I went. No trash, no footprints, no cut branches. Only the faintest line of earth packed down by what must have been hikers long before me. The stillness was calming at first. It felt like I was walking into a place people had forgotten. The smell of pine needles mixed with the faint odor of damp soil. Every so often I stopped just to listen. My own breathing and the beat of my heart seemed louder out there, as though the forest absorbed every other sound. Around midday, I reached a clearing where fallen trees had opened a small patch of sky. I set my pack down, ate a granola bar, and drank half a bottle of water. I studied the map. According to the paper, if I followed the trail another few miles, it would loop back toward a ridge that eventually connected to a main road. I figured I could complete it as a long-day hike if I kept a steady pace. When I packed up and started again, the path grew rougher. Roots twisted out of the dirt, rocks scattered loose across the slope. At one point, I had to crouch under branches so low they almost blocked the trail completely. The blazes on the trees were faint now, just flakes of red paint almost lost under layers of bark and moss. A few times I lost them and had to circle back, scanning trunks until I caught sight of the next faded mark. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't anything clear at first, just a sense that the forest was watching me. I brushed it off as imagination, the same way you notice shapes in the corner of your eye when you're alone too long. Still, my steps grew quicker. I focused harder on the ground, keeping my eyes on the trail, but my ears picked up every creak and snap around me. By mid-afternoon, the trail dropped steeply into a ravine. The descent was slow, my boots sliding on loose dirt, hands grabbing trees to steady myself. At the bottom, a stream trickled through stones, cold and clear. I crouched to fill my bottle, splashed water on my face, and looked around. The ravine was narrow and shadowed, the kind of place where sunlight only touched the rocks for a short time each day. The air was cooler here, but it felt heavy, almost like the walls of the ravine pressed down on me. I crossed the stream and searched for the next blaze. It took longer this time. The paint had almost faded completely, and I only spotted it by chance on a tree far up the opposite slope. The climb was worse than the descent. My legs burned, and I slipped more than once, my palms scraping against bark and stone. When I reached the top, sweat was running down my back, soaking my shirt. The forest on this side felt different, darker. The trees grew closer together, branches twisting low, blocking out much of the light. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen branches that cracked under my weight. I checked the map again, though it didn't tell me much. The trail was just a faint line here, and I wasn't sure I was exactly where the map showed. I pushed forward anyway, following what looked like the faint remains of a path. Time seemed to stretch. I checked my watch and realized hours had passed faster than I expected. The shadows were longer now, the light turning golden. I thought I should have seen the ridge by this point, but all I found were more trees, more slopes, more silence. A knot of unease grew in me. I stopped and tried to retrace my steps, but the ground gave no sign of where I had come from. The faint trail I thought I was following disappeared into leaves and undergrowth. I spun slowly in place, scanning for blazes, but there were none. My chest tightened as I realized I had lost the trail completely. I forced myself to stay calm. I took out the map and compass, tried to line them up. If I was where I thought, heading north should eventually bring me toward the ridge. I chose a landmark, a tall split tree, and aimed straight for it, careful not to wander. But the forest seemed endless. Every tree looked like the last. The ground dipped and rose unpredictably, pulling me off my line. I tried to correct, but soon I wasn't sure which way I was really going. The sky darkened fast, the last light fading behind the treetops. By the time I admitted I was lost, night was pressing in. The forest filled with the sounds of insects and the occasional rustle of unseen animals. I set my pack down, pulled out the tarp, and tied it low between two trees to make a crude shelter. I sat under it, knees to my chest, listening. The night stretched long. Every snap of a twig jolted me awake. I couldn't see far, only the faint circle of light from my headlamp. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, but when I shone the light, there was nothing. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer. Still, I barely slept. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, I packed quickly and started moving again. My throat was dry, my stomach hollow, but I forced myself to keep walking. I picked a direction that felt uphill, hoping it would lead me to the ridge. Hours passed. Sweat soaked me, my legs trembling with exhaustion. The forest gave no sign of ending. At times I thought I heard water, only to find it was the wind moving through leaves. My water bottle grew lighter with each sip, and I knew I had to ration it. By midday, I stumbled upon something that froze me in place. In a small clearing lay a torn backpack, sun-faded and half-buried under leaves. Its straps were frayed, the fabric shredded as if animals had chewed through it. I knelt and brushed dirt away. Inside were scraps of clothing, a crushed water bottle, and nothing else. No name, no ID, just abandoned. The sight of it made my skin crawl. Someone else had been here before me, and whatever happened, they had not taken their pack with them. I backed away quickly and pushed on, fear gnawing at me. As the day dragged, the forest seemed to close tighter. The silence deepened, broken only by my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I stumbled often now, catching my boots on roots, my arms trembling from lack of food and water. By late afternoon, the ground sloped again, and I finally saw light breaking through ahead. I pushed forward, branches whipping my face, until I burst onto an open ridge. The sight almost dropped me to my knees. Rolling hills stretched below, and far in the distance I could see a thin silver line of road cutting through trees. Relief mixed with dread. The road was far, maybe miles, and the sun was already dipping low again. I forced myself to keep moving, sliding down slopes, grabbing branches to slow my descent. My legs shook with every step, but the thought of reaching that road drove me on. The forest fought me the whole way. Dense undergrowth tore at my clothes, fallen logs blocked my path, and rocks shifted under my boots. I lost my footing more than once, tumbling and scraping my arms raw. By the time I stumbled out of the last line of trees, the sky was deep red with sunset. The road lay only a short distance away. My chest ached with relief as I staggered toward it, every step heavy but determined. When my boots finally hit asphalt, I almost collapsed. I stood in the middle of the road, gasping, sweat dripping, staring at the empty stretch of pavement. No cars passed, no voices called, only silence. But I was out. I had made it. I followed the road until darkness swallowed the forest behind me, and after what felt like hours, headlights finally cut through the night. I waved frantically until the car slowed, and the driver stopped to help. The moment I climbed inside and the doors shut, the weight of the forest lifted from me. My body shook uncontrollably, exhaustion flooding in. I knew then how close I had come to disappearing out there, just another lost hiker whose trail ended. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for a while, something that would push me out of my comfort zone. I wanted to go deep into the woods where not many people went, far away from the crowds and noise of the usual trails. I found a stretch of wilderness that wasn't well known, but still mapped. It wasn't an official park, just miles of thick forest, rough ridges, creeks, and logging roads that had long been abandoned. It seemed like the perfect place to clear my head. I packed my backpack with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, extra clothes, a first aid kit, flashlight, lighter, knife, and a map. I made sure my gear was in good condition. I knew that once I went in, I'd be depending only on myself. The plan was simple: hike in for a day and a half, camp deep inside, then turn around and come back the same way. The first morning started clear and cool. I parked my car at the edge of an overgrown service road and began walking. The trees were tall and pressed close together. At first, I felt excited. The trail was faint, but I could still see it weaving through the woods. Birds called overhead, and I could hear the distant rush of water somewhere below. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. By mid-afternoon, I had walked far enough that I no longer heard the distant hum of cars or saw signs of houses. It was just trees, moss, and dirt. My boots crunched against roots, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. I set up my first camp near a creek that evening. The ground was damp but firm enough for my tent. I collected some water, filtered it, ate a simple meal, and stretched out. The air cooled fast once the sun dipped behind the trees. I crawled into my sleeping bag and listened to the sounds outside. I heard insects, a few branches snapping from the weight of animals, and the trickle of the creek. It was calm, but also strangely heavy, as if the forest was watching. The next day, I pushed deeper. The trail grew harder to follow. Sometimes I lost it completely and had to backtrack. The forest floor was uneven, with fallen trees blocking my way. I sweated under the weight of my pack, and my legs burned from the effort. But I liked it, felt raw and real. By mid-afternoon, I reached a ridge that overlooked a valley. It stretched for miles with no clearings or roads in sight. I hadn't seen a single person since I started. I stood there for a while, catching my breath, and let the silence sink in. It was peaceful, but there was also a sense of isolation that made my stomach tighten. That night, I camped farther in, this time away from water. The forest was thicker, and the canopy blocked most of the fading light. I built a small fire and sat close to it as the dark pressed in. The flames flickered against the trunks, throwing shadows that shifted with every gust of wind. I felt safe near the fire, but I noticed how black the woods were beyond its reach. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I heard something faint. It wasn't the normal rustle of animals. It was steady, almost like careful footsteps. They crunched lightly on the forest floor, then stopped. I held my breath. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the forest was almost completely dark. I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet. The sound started again, closer this time. My chest tightened. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the steps were too slow, too controlled. Not the random scurry of wildlife. Whoever or whatever it was, it moved with purpose. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife I kept beside my sleeping bag. My ears strained in the silence. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked the ground around my camp. The dirt was disturbed in places, but I couldn't tell if it was fresh or just old marks. There weren't clear boot prints, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I thought about turning back. I was deep enough into the forest that the thought of another night unsettled me. But part of me wanted to push on, maybe just a little farther. I convinced myself it was just nerves. I kept walking. The forest grew denser. The trail disappeared completely, so I followed my compass and the direction I had planned. Hours passed and I felt more uneasy. The woods were strangely quiet, as if even the birds avoided this place. Late in the afternoon, I found a clearing. In the middle of it was something I didn't expect to see. An old hunting blind made from branches and scraps of wood. It was falling apart, but it hadn't been there for decades. Some of the wood looked weathered, but other parts looked newer, as if someone had repaired it recently. I walked closer, heart thudding. The blind was empty, just a crude structure. But seeing it there made me feel less alone in the worst way. It meant people came out here, people who didn't mind being deep in the middle of nowhere. I didn't want to stay near it, so I kept moving until dusk forced me to stop. I set up camp quickly and skipped a fire this time. I thought maybe staying dark would make me less noticeable. I ate cold food and crawled into my tent early. That night was worse. I lay awake, listening. At some point, I heard it again. Faint steps in the underbrush. This time, they circled slowly. They stopped, then started again from another side. My skin crawled. I clutched my knife and tried not to breathe too loudly. At one point, I swore I heard breathing outside my tent. Slow and steady, just a few feet away. My whole body shook, but I didn't move. I stayed like that until exhaustion finally dragged me into shallow sleep. When I woke at dawn, everything was quiet. I crawled out and looked around. A few feet from my tent, in the dirt, there were marks. Not clear footprints, but enough to tell me something had stood there, watching. That was it for me. I decided to head back. The idea of another night out there with whatever was stalking me was unbearable. I packed quickly and started retracing my steps. But the forest didn't look the same. I tried to follow my compass, but the terrain was confusing. The ridges and valleys twisted in ways that didn't match the map. I realized I wasn't sure if I was even on the right path. The more I walked, the worse it got. I found myself going in circles, passing the same fallen tree twice. My throat went dry. I tried to stay calm and focused, but panic pressed at the edges of my thoughts. By midday, I stumbled into another clearing. This one had signs of use. The grass was flattened, and there was a fire pit made of stones. It wasn't old. Ash and charred would still lay inside. Someone had camped here not long ago. I crouched, scanning the area. There were no tents, no gear, nothing left behind. Just the fire pit. And then I noticed something else. Nailed into a nearby tree was a piece of rope, frayed and stained. It looked wrong. My stomach churned. I didn't stay long. I turned and hurried away, desperate to put distance between me and that place. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I swore I saw movement sometimes, just at the edge of my vision. A shape slipping behind a tree, a flicker of motion in the brush. But whenever I looked straight, there was nothing. The sun dropped lower, and I knew I'd have to camp again whether I wanted to or not. My legs were burning, and my water was running low. I found a small rise and set my tent up there. I forced myself to light a fire this time, thinking it might keep animals or people away. I barely ate. My stomach was twisted too tight. I sat by the fire, knife on my knee, eyes darting to the dark around me. Hours crawled by. Every snap of a twig made my pulse jump. Sometime in the dead of night, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, steady, circling. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond it, the blackness felt alive. I gripped my knife so hard my hand ached. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move between the trees. Tall, human-shaped. I blinked, and it was gone. My chest hammered. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat there, watching, waiting, heart pounding until dawn finally bled into the sky. The next day, I was drained but more determined than ever to get out. I shoved my gear into my pack and pushed forward, checking the compass again and again, trying to move west toward where I knew the road should be. Hours passed. My legs felt like lead. My lips cracked from thirst, but I kept going. I didn't care about the trail anymore, I just wanted out. Late in the afternoon, I heard something behind me. I turned fast. For a split second, I swore I saw a figure between the trees. Not close, but there, watching. I didn't wait. I ran. My pack bounced, branches whipped at my face, but I didn't care. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs shook. Finally, I burst out onto an old logging road. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I followed the road, and after what felt like forever, I saw the faint glint of my car through the trees. My knees nearly gave out. I reached it, fumbled my I always liked being outdoors, and hiking was something that gave me a kind of peace that nothing else really did. Being away from busy streets, screens, and noise always felt like resetting my mind. That's why when I had a few days off work, I decided to take a solo hiking trip. I had done plenty of day hikes before, and I wasn't inexperienced, but I had never done one that would take me deep into an area far from towns and roads. I thought this would be the challenge I needed, something that could give me that sense of being completely away from everything. I planned my route carefully. It was a long loop trail in the mountains, not extremely well-traveled, but not unknown either. I had read online that some people only did parts of it because the full loop could take multiple days depending on speed and stamina. I figured I could do it in 2.5 days. I packed enough food, water filtration gear, extra clothes, a headlamp, a tent, and a sleeping bag. My backpack was heavy, but I convinced myself that it was worth it because I had prepared for most situations. The first morning was calm. The sky was clear, with only thin clouds stretching over the peaks in the distance. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that makes you want to breathe deeper. I parked my car at the trailhead, checked my pack one more time, and started walking. The trail began wide, with crushed gravel and enough space for 2 people to walk side by side. It didn't stay like that for long. Within the first hour, it narrowed and twisted into steeper switchbacks. I could feel the weight of my pack pulling on my shoulders, but I kept a steady pace. At first, I wasn't thinking much beyond the simple rhythm of my boots hitting dirt and the sound of birds hidden in the trees. I had seen pictures of the trail online, so I knew parts of it opened up to long views of valleys and ridges, but most of it wound through heavy forest. It wasn't dark, just thick enough that I couldn't see far past the tree trunks. By midday, I had climbed a good amount of elevation. Sweat stuck my shirt to my back, and my legs already felt heavier than I expected. I stopped at a small clearing, pulled off my pack, and sat on a log to drink water and eat a snack. That was when I realized how quiet it had become. The kind of quiet where you hear your own chewing louder than anything else. It wasn't unusual for forests to get quiet at certain times of the day, but something about it made me notice how far I was from anyone. I hadn't seen a single person since leaving the trailhead. After resting, I pushed on. The afternoon passed with more climbing, more winding paths, and occasional glimpses of the mountainsides. When I reached a higher ridge, I could finally see far out across the valley. The peaks looked sharper at this height, the trees below spreading like a green blanket that stretched endlessly. I paused to take it in, but the silence pressed on me again. No voices, no distant traffic, no sign of any movement except the slow drift of clouds. I set up camp that evening in a flat patch off the trail. I pitched my tent, collected water from a nearby stream, filtered it, and cooked one of my meals. Sitting there, eating from a pouch, I realized I hadn't checked in with anyone all day. I had left my phone in airplane mode to save battery, and there was no signal anyway. I didn't think much of it then. That night was colder than I expected. The temperature dropped quickly after the sun set. Inside the tent, I curled into my sleeping bag, listening to the creaks of trees and the occasional snap of branches in the distance. My brain wanted to label every noise as an animal, which it probably was, but lying in the dark always made the mind wander into worse places. I pulled the bag tighter around me and eventually fell asleep. The second day started early. My legs were sore, but I forced myself to eat and pack up. The trail that day was rougher. Sections were overgrown, and I had to push branches out of my way. At one point, the path crossed a steep slope where loose rocks slid under my boots, and for a moment I thought I might lose my balance. I leaned heavily on my trekking poles and took careful steps until the ground leveled out again. Hours passed, and still I hadn't seen anyone. No hikers, no campers, nothing. I had expected at least a few people on a trail this long. Instead, it felt like I had walked into a place no one else bothered with anymore. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted. I checked my map and realized I was moving slower than planned. The trail was longer between landmarks than I remembered reading, and some of the switchbacks took far more energy. I felt a little uneasy at how off my timing was, but I convinced myself it was fine. I just had to push harder. When I finally reached the next flat area, I was too drained to go on. I set up camp again, this time on uneven ground where rocks dug under my tent floor. My legs ached badly, and my shoulders burned from the straps of my pack. I filtered more water, ate, and lay down as soon as the sun dipped. That night, the noises outside felt closer. Branches cracking, faint rustles through the undergrowth. I told myself it was just deer moving through, but every sound felt amplified in the dark. Sleep came in broken pieces. The third morning, I woke up late. My body felt heavy, as if I hadn't rested at all. I forced myself up, stuffed my gear into the pack, and started moving. The trail climbed again, this time into rockier terrain where the trees thinned and the wind cut sharper across the open ridges. It should have been beautiful, but my legs shook with each step. That was when I noticed the first problem. My water bladder was nearly empty. I had counted on another stream by midday, but when I reached the spot marked on the map, it was dry. The ground was cracked, leaves brittle. Panic stirred in my chest, but I swallowed it down. I still had a half-liter in a bottle, but that wouldn't last long. I checked the map again, found another marked stream further along, and pushed myself to keep going. The trail narrowed into rough, uneven stretches. My boots slipped several times, and my knees throbbed. Hours passed with no sign of water. My mouth felt like sand, and each swallow hurt my throat. I started rationing sips, trying not to think about it. Late in the afternoon, my legs nearly gave out climbing a steep incline. I had to stop, bend over, gasping for air. Sweat ran into my eyes, and my head pounded. I checked the map again, but doubt clawed at me now. What if I had misread? What if the streams were all dry this time of year? I cursed myself for not checking conditions better. When I finally stumbled onto a small trickle of water seeping from rocks, it felt like salvation. I dropped my pack, dug out my filter, and drank greedily. My body shook as the cold water hit my stomach, but I didn't care. I filled every container I had before moving again. By the time the sun started setting, I was still miles from the point I thought I'd reach. My legs dragged, my shoulders felt bruised from the pack, and every step seemed heavier than the last. I needed a place to camp, but the trail clung to steep slopes with no flat ground. I walked until darkness forced me to stop, finally clearing a small space just wide enough for the tent. That night was the worst. The noises outside never stopped. Something larger than a deer moved through the brush at one point, heavy enough to snap thick branches. My chest tightened as I lay frozen, staring at the tent ceiling. I clutched the knife I kept in my pack, though I knew it wouldn't do much against a bear or mountain lion. The sound eventually faded, but my nerves stayed raw. Morning brought no relief. My body was wrecked from little sleep, dehydration, and soreness. I packed up slowly, each motion a fight. The trail didn't let up. It wound higher into exposed ridges where the sun beat down mercilessly. I felt dizzy at times, my vision blurring at the edges. I stopped often, leaning on my poles, telling myself just one more step, one more stretch. By midday, I knew I couldn't finish the loop in time. My pace was too slow and the distance too much. I needed to cut across toward the nearest exit point, but the side trail that led out was barely marked. The path narrowed, overgrown, as if no one had used it in years. As I followed it, the fear of being truly lost started to gnaw at me. Every turn looked the same: trees, rocks, dirt. I checked my map again and again, but the trail was faint, easy to lose in the undergrowth. Once, I backtracked nearly half a mile when I realized I had followed a game path instead of the real trail. Exhaustion deepened. My legs shook violently on descents, and my knees buckled more than once. I stumbled, catching myself on trees. My pack felt like a crushing weight digging into my spine. At one point, I dropped to the ground and just sat, staring at nothing, too tired to think. But I knew stopping for good wasn't an option. If I stayed there, no one would come. I hadn't told anyone my exact route, only the general area. That mistake hit me hard now. so I forced myself up again. One step, then another. I kept repeating it in my head. One step, don't stop. Hours dragged by. The light began to change, shadows stretching long again. My chest tightened as I realized I might not make it out before dark. But I have always liked hiking alone. It gives me a kind of peace that I do not find anywhere else. I like the feeling of carrying everything I need on my back, walking away from noise, and stepping into places where the only sounds are wind, water, and the crunch of dirt under my boots. But there was one hike a few years ago that still comes back to me in dreams. I thought I was prepared, but I was not ready for what happened. It was late summer. The days were long and hot, and the nights were still cool enough to sleep without sweating. I had some time off work and wanted to do a long hike that would take me away from people. I chose a trail that ran through a mountain range I had never visited before. It was not a popular place, and that was part of the reason I chose it. I read a little about the trail. It was rough in some sections, with steep climbs and long stretches without water, but I figured I could handle it. I packed what I always did: a good tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 5 days, water filter, maps, compass, extra clothes, and some basic first aid. I was in decent shape at that time, and I felt strong enough to carry my pack. My plan was to hike out about 20 miles, camp near a small lake I saw on the map, stay there a night or two, and then head back. Simple enough. The first day went well. The trailhead was empty except for one other car. I tightened the straps on my pack and started up the path. The air smelled like pine and dust. The ground was dry, and small stones shifted under my boots as I climbed. For hours, I didn't see a single person. The trail twisted through trees and opened into clearings where I could see far-off peaks. It was everything I wanted. I reached a ridge in the late afternoon. I could see the valley below, covered in thick forest. Somewhere down there was the lake I was aiming for, though I couldn't see it yet. I stopped, drank water, and ate a quick snack. The air was cooler up high, and I felt a light breeze against my face. I pushed on, eager to get closer to where I planned to sleep. That first night was calm. I found a flat spot just off the trail and set up my tent. I boiled water, made a simple meal, and watched the sky fade from blue to orange to black. The stars came out in huge numbers, clearer than I ever saw back home. I lay in my tent, listening to the faint rustle of wind through the trees, and I slept well. The second day was harder. The trail dropped steeply into the valley. Going down was tough on my knees, and I had to watch every step to avoid slipping on loose dirt and rocks. I used my trekking poles to keep balance, but even with them, I stumbled a few times. The forest grew thicker as I descended, and the air felt damp. The sun broke through in small patches, but much of the trail was in shade. Around midday, I noticed how quiet it was. There were birds, yes, but fewer than I expected. No people, no far-off planes, not even the distant hum of traffic. Just trees, rocks, and silence. At first, it felt peaceful, but after hours of it, the quiet began to press in. My ears searched for sounds and found nothing. I reached the bottom of the valley late in the afternoon. My legs were sore, and my shoulders ached from the weight of my pack. The map showed a small creek nearby, so I searched until I found it. The water was running clear, and I refilled my bottles. I thought about camping there, but I wanted to get closer to the lake before stopping. The trail narrowed as I continued. It looked less used than the upper part, overgrown in spots. Branches brushed against my arms and legs. I followed it as it twisted through the forest. Light was fading faster than I expected, the trees making the valley dim. I knew I had to pick a campsite soon. Then I came to a section where the trail was washed out. A landslide had taken out a chunk of it, leaving a steep slope of loose dirt and rocks. I stood there, breathing heavy, staring at it. I could climb across, but one wrong step would send me sliding down into the trees below. I thought about turning back, but I didn't want to lose the miles I had already covered. I tested the slope carefully. The dirt gave way under my boots, but I leaned on my poles and managed to keep balance. Slowly, step by step, I made it across. My heart was pounding, sweat running down my back, but I was safe. I kept moving, eager to find a campsite before it got dark. I finally found a flat spot near a cluster of boulders. It was not ideal, but I was too tired to keep going. I set up my tent as the light disappeared. My hands shook slightly from fatigue, and I rushed to boil water for food. The silence around me felt heavier that night. I lay in my tent, staring at the nylon above me, and I couldn't fall asleep right away. Every small crack of a branch outside made me freeze. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The third day was when things started going wrong. I woke up sore but ready to reach the lake. I packed up and started hiking again. The trail grew harder to follow. Parts of it were covered by fallen branches or rocks, and I had to stop often to check the map. I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. By midday, I felt uneasy. I wasn't completely lost, but I wasn't sure where I was either. The trees all looked the same, tall and thick, blocking my view of the sky. My compass showed the direction I needed to go, but the trail under my feet kept fading. I told myself it was fine. I would reach the lake soon, but the hours dragged on, and there was no sign of water. My stomach twisted with hunger, but I didn't want to stop. I felt like I needed to keep moving. Sweat soaked my shirt, and my boots rubbed blisters into my heels. I drank more water than I planned, which made me worry. Late in the afternoon, I finally heard what I thought was rushing water. My heart lifted. I followed the sound, pushing through thick brush, only to find a steep ravine. A narrow stream ran at the bottom, far smaller than I expected. I crouched down and refilled my bottles anyway, filtering carefully. My legs trembled as I stood back up. I thought about setting up camp nearby, but the ground was uneven. So I kept going, even though the light was fading again. I climbed over roots, pushed through branches, and stumbled on rocks. My body felt heavier with each step. When it grew dark, I had no choice. I set up my tent on a small patch of dirt, barely big enough. I ate little, too tired to cook properly. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, my body aching, my mind racing. I knew I had lost the trail. I told myself I would find it again in the morning, but deep down, I felt a pit of fear growing. The fourth day was worse. The forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same. I tried to backtrack, but I couldn't find the spots I remembered. My compass pointed north, but I didn't know if the trail was still there. I felt panic start to rise, and I forced myself to breathe slowly. I decided to climb higher, thinking I could spot the lake or the ridge I came from. The climb was brutal. My pack felt twice as heavy. Sweat dripped into my eyes. I slipped more than once, scraping my hands on rocks. When I finally reached a high point, I looked out and saw nothing but trees, stretching for miles. No lake, no trail. That was the moment I knew I was lost. Not just off trail for a few hours, completely lost. My throat went dry, and I sat there on the rocks, staring out. I had planned the hike for weeks before it finally happened. It wasn't the kind of trip where you just throw some snacks into a bag and head out for a short walk. This was supposed to be a 2-day hike through an area I had never explored before. A section of forest known for its long and winding trails, thick woods, and stretches of land where phone's signal vanished completely. I had read about it online and studied the map several times, marking the trailhead, the camping area, and the path that looped back out. On paper, it looked straightforward. In my head, it felt like an exciting challenge. The morning I left, I woke up early and packed my gear carefully. I had a sturdy backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, a cooking stove, and enough food to last more than 2 days. I had water bottles and a filter in case I ran out. I checked everything twice, even 3 times, because I didn't want to make a mistake. I was going alone, and that meant every detail mattered. When I arrived at the trailhead, the lot was empty except for one car parked near the trees. It looked like it had been there overnight. The morning was cool and damp, with a low mist hanging over the forest. The air smelled of wet soil and pine. I felt the usual nervousness I always did before stepping into a new place. Even though I had hiked many times before, Every new trail carried its own weight. I started walking, the sound of gravel crunching under my boots fading as the forest closed in around me. The trail was narrow but easy to follow at first. The trees stood tall and close together, their branches weaving a ceiling above me. The ground was damp, and patches of moss spread across rocks and tree trunks. I took slow, steady steps, trying to settle into the rhythm of the hike. The weight of my pack dug into my shoulders, but it was bearable. As the hours passed, I moved deeper into the woods. The trail bent and curved, climbing gently in some places and dropping in others. I noticed how quickly the silence grew once I was a few miles in. No cars, no voices, not even the faint hum of a distant road. Only the occasional bird call and the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. At first, it felt peaceful, but then the quietness began to press down on me. I found myself listening more closely than usual, every crack of a branch making me glance over my shoulder. By midday, I had covered several miles. I stopped near a stream to refill my bottle and eat something. The water was cold and fast-moving, sliding over smooth rocks. I crouched there, chewing slowly, staring into the trees as if I expected something to appear. The feeling was hard to shake, that sense of being watched. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just the stillness of the place. But it lingered. Back on the trail, I pushed forward. The map had shown a marked campsite not far ahead, a flat area where hikers often set up for the night. I figured I would get there by late afternoon, set up my tent, and cook an early meal before it got dark. That was the plan. But the forest had its own ideas. The trail grew narrower and less defined. Roots crossed the ground like veins, and fallen branches forced me to step around them. At one point, I reached a section where the path split faintly into two directions. My map didn't show a split here. I paused, looking from one side to the other. Both seemed equally worn, though not by much. I picked the left one, thinking it looked slightly clearer. As I followed it, the ground began to slope upward. The climb was steady but tiring, and I could feel sweat running down my back. The trees blocked most of the sun, making it hard to judge the time. I checked my watch, realizing the afternoon was slipping away faster than I had expected. Eventually, I reached a ridge. The view opened for a moment, giving me a glimpse of endless trees stretching to the horizon. I should have felt amazed, but instead I felt small and isolated, like I had stepped into a place that didn't want me there. I pulled out my map again, trying to match the landmarks, but nothing lined up. The ridge wasn't on my route. A knot tightened in my stomach. I knew what it meant. I had taken the wrong trail. I tried to calm myself, reasoning that I could just turn back and find the right path again. I retraced my steps, but after several minutes, I couldn't find the split where I had gone wrong. The trail behind me didn't look the same anymore. Every tree looked familiar yet different, as if the forest had shifted while I wasn't looking. I kept moving, convinced I would find the main path again. But the further I went, the less clear the trail became. The dirt path faded into patches of grass, then into uneven ground covered in leaves. Soon, there was no trail at all, only trees surrounding me in every direction. The realization hit me slowly but heavily. I was lost. At first, I tried to treat it like a small mistake. I told myself I just needed to move downhill, find water, and follow it until it led me somewhere. I pushed through the undergrowth, snapping branches and leaving marks to remember my way. The forest floor was uneven, scattered with rocks and dips. My legs grew tired, but I kept going. By the time the light began to fade, I still hadn't found the trail. The forest turned darker, shadows growing between the trunks. I knew I had to set up camp before it became too hard to see. I found a small clearing, just wide enough for my tent. I dropped my pack with relief, my shoulders aching. Setting up the tent felt mechanical, my hands moving quickly as the fear settled deeper in my chest. When the tent was finally up, I crawled inside and zipped it shut. The thin fabric felt like my only barrier against the vast darkness outside. I cooked a small meal with shaky hands, forcing myself to eat even though my stomach was tight with anxiety. The sound of boiling water seemed too loud in the silence, as if it might draw something closer. That night, I lay awake listening. Every sound became sharper. The wind through the trees, the snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves. At one point, I heard heavy steps nearby. Not the quick, light movement of an animal, but something slower, heavier. My whole body froze. The sound moved past, fading into the distance, but I didn't sleep after that. When morning came, I felt drained. My eyes were gritty from lack of rest, and my body ached. I packed quickly, desperate to move. I decided to follow the sun, keeping it to one side as I walked, hoping it would guide me in a consistent direction. Hours passed, but the trees never thinned. My water was running low, and although I found a stream later, the unease never left me. The second night was worse than the first. I built no fire, too afraid it would be seen from far away. I ate in silence and lay awake again, the forest pressing against me. At some point, I heard something large moving just beyond the tent. The footsteps circled, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, clutching my knife, praying it wouldn't come closer. The steps eventually stopped, but the dread stayed with me until morning. On the third day, exhaustion pushed me forward more than anything. My feet were blistered, my shoulders bruised from the straps of my pack. I stumbled over roots and rocks, barely catching myself from falling. My thoughts grew scattered, shifting between determination and despair. I kept thinking about how easy it would be to collapse and give up. By late afternoon, I saw something that made my chest tighten. A piece of trash caught in a bush. It was a crumpled energy bar wrapper, the kind hikers carried. I grabbed it with shaking hands, realizing I must be near a trail again. I pushed on harder, scanning every direction. Soon, I spotted faint boot prints in the dirt. My heart pounded as I followed them, each step feeling like a lifeline. The prints led to a trail, a real one this time, clear, wide, and marked. Relief hit me so hard I nearly dropped to my knees. I followed it, barely noticing the pain in my body anymore. Eventually, the trees began to thin, and I saw the faint outline of a parking area through the branches. When I stepped out of the forest and onto the gravel lot, I almost cried. My car sat there, waiting, the only one left. I leaned against it, shaking, unable to believe I had made it back. I drove away slowly, my body trembling, my mind replaying everything. The forest had swallowed me for days, and I had come close to disappearing in it. I realized how fragile the line was between being safe and being lost, how quickly control slipped away once the trail vanished. That trip left its mark on me. I never forgot the sounds at night, the endless trees, and the crushing silence. I learned how thin the fabric of safety really is when you're alone out there, and how easy it is for the forest to remind you that you don't belong. I started out early that morning, long before the sun had fully risen above the ridges in the east. The air was still cold, and a low mist clung to the valley floor. I had been planning this hike for weeks, studying the maps, loading up my backpack with the basics, and checking the weather forecast more than once. It was supposed to be a simple 2-day trip, up an old trail that wasn't maintained anymore, through a long stretch of thick forest, and out into a section of high ground that would give me a wide view of the surrounding mountains. I wanted solitude, quiet, and a challenge. I parked my car on the side of a dirt road where the old trailhead used to be marked. The wooden post that once held a sign was snapped off halfway, and the path itself was nearly overgrown, but I had read enough trip reports online to know that people still used it. Not many, but enough to leave faint signs. That was exactly what I wanted. A place far enough away from crowded trails where I wouldn't see people every 5 minutes. The first stretch was easier than I expected. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and though the trail was faint, I could make it out if I kept my eyes open. My boots crunched through damp soil, and I could smell the wet bark of trees warming as the sun finally started cutting through the mist. The forest was dense, tall pines mixed with thick underbrush, and the sound of birds echoed above. Every now and then I saw claw marks on tree trunks, black bears most likely, and once I saw fresh scat right in the middle of the path. That didn't bother me much. I had bear spray clipped to my belt, and I wasn't moving carelessly. By mid-morning, I was sweating. The trail climbed gradually, switchbacking through steeper sections, and the sun had burned off the mist. I paused several times to drink water and catch my breath, leaning against trees and looking at the way the light cut through the forest. It was beautiful, but it was also starting to feel more remote than I had pictured. I hadn't seen any sign of recent human travel. No boot prints, no broken branches from hikers, not even faded tape markers. Just the faint indentation of what used to be a maintained path. I pushed on. The hours rolled by. Around noon, I stopped for lunch, pulling out a protein bar and jerky, drinking deeply from my water bottle. I checked my map and compass. The trail was supposed to follow a long ridge and then curve down toward a stream where a few flat campsites had been marked years ago. My plan was to camp near that stream, spend the night, and then continue up to the viewpoint the next morning before heading back down. But as I kept hiking, something started to feel wrong. The trail became harder to follow. Sections disappeared completely into undergrowth, forcing me to scan for the next faint sign of where it picked back up. Once or twice I had to backtrack, realizing I had gone the wrong way. I looked at my compass and tried to stay aligned with the map, but every step off trail made me nervous. My pace slowed. The quiet of the forest pressed in heavier, and I noticed the wind had died down, leaving the woods strangely still. By late afternoon, my legs ached. My shirt clung to me with sweat. When I finally reached the stream, it was smaller than I expected, trickling between mossy rocks, but it was water. I filtered enough to refill my bottles and looked for a place to camp. I found a flat patch of ground above the stream where the trees thinned just enough to let a little light in. I dropped my pack and set up my tent slowly, feeling the relief of knowing I could finally rest. As I boiled water for dinner, I noticed how quickly the forest darkened. The shadows grew long and the air cooled fast. I ate in silence, listening to the distant rush of water and the occasional snap of branches from who knows what moving out there. I had camped alone before, but there was something about this place that felt heavier. I double-checked the perimeter of my camp, tied up my food bag, and tried to reassure myself that this was exactly what I wanted. Real solitude, away from everything. That night, sleep did not come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the thin nylon walls of the tent, hearing every sound. Something moved in the brush once, close enough that I could hear it breathing. I gripped the bear spray tightly, heart pounding, waiting for the noise to fade. Eventually, it did. Hours passed in restless dozing, every small sound waking me again. When morning finally came, I felt like I had barely rested. I packed up, forcing myself to eat something even though my stomach was uneasy. The trail was supposed to climb steeply up the ridge from here, toward the viewpoint. I crossed the stream and started climbing, pushing through more overgrowth. My legs were heavy, and my back ached under the weight of the pack. Halfway up, I realized something was wrong again. The faint trail I thought I was following curved too sharply, leading me into thicker brush. I stopped, pulled out the map, and frowned. I should have been heading northeast, but my compass needle showed me pointing west. I adjusted, trying to cut back the other way, but the slope grew steeper and the ground softer, breaking apart under my boots. I kept climbing, but with every step it felt like I was drifting further from where I was supposed to be. By midday, panic had started gnawing at me. The trail was gone, completely. I stood on a slope, trees packed tight around me, and there was no sign of the faint indentation that had guided me before. I looked at the map again, but the terrain didn't match. My compass pointed steadily north, but I couldn't be sure which ridge I was actually on. I forced myself to stop and breathe. I needed to think clearly. I drank water, tried to calm down, and made a plan. If I kept heading east, I should eventually hit the ridgeline that would lead to the viewpoint. Once I reached that, I could reorient myself. It sounded simple enough, but the forest had other plans. The slope became harder to climb, the soil crumbling underfoot, sending rocks tumbling down behind me. My calves burned, and sweat dripped into my eyes. The trees grew so close that I had to squeeze between them, branches tearing at my pack and scratching my arms. More than once I slipped, sliding several feet before catching myself. My confidence was draining fast. Then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong, distant, sharp, like metal striking rock. I froze. My first thought was another hiker, maybe someone setting up camp or dropping gear. Relief washed over me for a moment. I listened, straining. The sound came again, fainter this time, echoing strangely through the trees. I tried to follow it, climbing toward it, but after a few minutes it faded completely, leaving only the silence of the woods. I pressed on, but the forest seemed endless. Hours blurred together. My thighs cramped, and my water was running low again. When I finally reached what I thought was the ridge, it wasn't a ridge at all. Just another steep incline leading higher. My stomach dropped. The sun was already dipping low. I had wasted most of the day, and I wasn't sure where I was anymore. I forced myself to set up camp again, this time on a narrow shelf of ground barely big enough for the tent. My body was trembling with exhaustion as I boiled the last of my food. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling exposed. That night was worse than the first. The forest came alive with noises, branches cracking, leaves shifting, the faint sound of something large moving on the slope above me. At one point, I heard rocks tumbling down, stopping just short of the tent. I gripped the bare spray until my hand hurt, waiting, staring at the dark. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I was weaker, slower, and more afraid than before. I had barely any food left, and my water supply was low. I packed up and tried again to find the ridge, but every step felt like wandering deeper into a maze with no way out. The forest pressed closer, and the terrain grew more unforgiving. By midday, I knew I was lost, truly lost. My map was useless now. Nothing lined up. My compass could only tell me directions, but without knowing where I was on the map, it didn't matter. Panic sat heavy in my chest, but I knew giving in to it would kill me. I needed water, I needed food, and I needed to keep moving. I decided to follow the slope downward. Streams always flowed down, and if I found one, I could follow it until it led to something bigger. Maybe even back to the valley where I had started. The descent was brutal. My knees screamed with every step, and my boots slipped on loose soil. I grabbed at branches to steady myself, sometimes breaking them off in my hands. Hours passed, and finally I heard the trickle of water. Relief flooded me when I saw a small stream cutting through the trees. I dropped to my knees, filtered what I could, and drank until my stomach ached. I followed the stream for the rest of the day, stumbling along its uneven banks. The forest thickened again, and the light dimmed early under the canopy. I knew I had to camp again. My body was running on fumes. That night, I barely slept. Something was moving out there, closer this time. I could hear deliberate footsteps, slow, circling. I lay frozen, my heart hammering, every muscle tensed. I had been planning the hiking trip for weeks, studying maps, tracing trails with my finger, and convincing myself that I was ready for the kind of solitude I hadn't experienced in years. I wanted quiet, a place where I wouldn't hear traffic, phones, or the noise of everyday life. The area I chose was known for long stretches of wilderness where hikers could go hours, sometimes even an entire day, without seeing another person. That was exactly what drew me in. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water, filter pump, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, spare batteries, fire starter, extra socks, rain gear, and a map folded into a plastic sleeve. My boots were already broken in from shorter hikes around home, and I felt ready. The morning I set out, the air was cool and damp, the kind that smelled like wet pine and fresh soil. I parked my car at a small gravel pull-off where the official trail began. The lot was empty, which didn't surprise me. It was a weekday morning in late spring, the kind of time when most people were at work. I locked up, adjusted the straps on my pack, and started down the trail. The first few miles were calm and easy. The dirt path cut through tall trees that leaned over like they wanted to touch shoulders. Sunlight broke through in patches, making moving spots of light on the ground. I kept my pace steady, not rushing but not dawdling either. Birds called from the branches, and once or twice I saw deer darting deeper into the woods when they caught my movement. My body felt good, legs strong, lungs open. By midday, I had covered more ground than I expected. I stopped near a creek, sat on a flat rock, and ate a sandwich I had packed. The water moved steady and cold, slipping over small stones and catching the sun in quick flashes. I refilled my bottle and drank deeply, letting the coolness settle in my chest. I checked the map and decided to push further, aiming for a ridge I had circled earlier. From there, I thought I'd get a wide view of the land and maybe find a good spot to camp for the night. The trail narrowed as I moved on. It twisted around fallen logs, ducked beneath low branches, and sometimes seemed to fade into nothing before reappearing a few steps later. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The birds weren't as loud anymore, and I noticed how heavy the air felt. My boots crunched on leaves and snapped twigs, and that sound seemed louder than it should have. After a while, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The trail markers, small rectangles of paint on trees, were spaced further apart. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself I must have just missed some. But then I realized I hadn't seen one in nearly 20 minutes. I stopped, pulled the map out, and tried to match the bends and streams I had passed with the lines on the paper. It didn't line up as neatly as I hoped. I told myself not to worry. I had a compass, I had daylight, and I wasn't truly lost. I just needed to backtrack a little until I found a marker. So I turned around and walked back. At least I thought I was walking back. The forest has a way of twisting on itself. The trees all looked alike, and the ground offered no clear signs. I kept moving, scanning each trunk for the flick of paint that would tell me I was back on track. Nothing. My heartbeat started to climb in my chest, and my steps grew faster. I told myself to calm down, but the truth pressed in heavy. I wasn't on the trail anymore. I forced myself to stop. Breathing hard, I set my pack down, crouched, and thought it through. Panic wouldn't help. I had water, food, shelter. I wasn't in danger yet. The map showed the creek I had stopped at earlier, and I knew water always led somewhere. If I could find it again, I could follow it until it crossed the trail or at least led me closer to where people might be. I walked carefully now, scanning the ground for damp soil, listening for the faint trickle of running water. After about half an hour, I found a thin stream cutting downhill. Relief washed over me. I followed it, stepping over rocks and weaving around trees. The water widened as I went, and I felt a spark of hope that I was doing the right thing. But the further I followed it, the more the terrain turned rough. The ground grew steep, the trees crowded tighter, and roots tangled across every step. My boots slipped on loose dirt, and at one point I slid several feet before catching myself against a trunk. My legs trembled as I steadied. I checked the time, late afternoon. The light had shifted, growing softer, shadows stretching longer. I needed to think about camp before dark. I scanned the area for a flat spot and found a clearing a short distance from the stream. It wasn't perfect. Roots jutted up and rocks poked through the soil, but it was better than stumbling on in the dark. I cleared a space, set up my tent, and gathered a small pile of wood for a fire. The smoke drifted up in thin lines as the flames took hold, and I cooked a simple meal on my small stove. I ate slowly, every sound around me sinking into my ears. The forest was alive in a different way now. The clicks of insects, the distant rustle of something moving through leaves, the low calls of night birds. When the fire burned low, I crawled into my tent and zipped the door shut. My body ached from the day, and I stretched out on my sleeping bag. I expected to fall asleep quickly, but my mind wouldn't settle. Every crack outside made me freeze. At one point, I heard something moving close, slow steps like weight pressing down leaves. I held my breath, staring at the nylon wall of the tent, heart pounding so loud I was sure it could be heard. The steps lingered, then faded away. I don't know how long I lay awake, but eventually exhaustion dragged me under. Morning came with gray light and damp air. My back was stiff, and my face felt swollen from poor sleep. I forced myself up, packed my gear, and checked the map again. The stream was my lifeline now. If I followed it long enough, I believed it would either lead me to a larger river or cross paths with a road. It was the only plan I had. The second day was harder. My legs were sore, my pack felt heavier, and the ground only grew more rugged. The stream sometimes split into smaller branches, and I had to choose which way to go. Every choice felt like a gamble. By midday, the sun burned hotter, and sweat soaked my shirt. I drank from my bottle more often, knowing I'd need to refill again soon. Around afternoon, I slipped badly on a wet rock, slamming my shin hard enough to make me yell out. Pain shot up my leg, and for a moment I sat on the ground gripping it, afraid I might not be able to walk. But after testing it, I realized it was bruised but not broken. I limped on, slower now, each step sending a dull throb through the bone. The forest seemed endless. Hours dragged. I started to notice things that felt wrong. The way certain trees seemed familiar, though I was sure I hadn't passed them before. The way the stream sometimes looped back in ways that didn't match the map. My sense of direction slipped further from me, and dread sat heavy in my chest. By evening, I knew I had to camp again. This time I set up closer to the stream, hoping the sound of running water would calm me. I built another small fire and ate, but my stomach felt tight. The food was fuel, nothing more. When darkness fell, the forest pressed close, and the noises seemed louder than the night before. Again, I heard steps outside the tent. Slow, heavy, closer than before. I froze, gripping the knife I kept beside me. The steps circled, then stopped. I waited, every muscle rigid, barely breathing. Minutes passed. Then the sound moved off, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep much at all after that. Day 3 began with fog. Thick white air clung low to the ground, wrapping around the trees and blinding me to more than a few yards ahead. I felt swallowed by it, like I was walking inside a cloud with no end. My leg ached worse, and my throat was dry even though I forced myself to drink slowly. By midday, I realized something that chilled me deeper than the night noises. My food was running low. I had packed enough for 3 days, maybe 4 if I rationed, but with my slower pace and constant detours, I wasn't sure how long I would be out here. I started cutting meals in half, chewing slowly, making every bite last. That afternoon, the ground dropped into a ravine. The stream tumbled down rocks into a small gorge, and I had no choice but to follow it. Climbing was dangerous. Slippery stone, loose dirt, sharp branches waiting to catch me. My hands shook as I lowered myself bit by bit. At one point, my foot slipped and I scraped my forearm deep on a jagged edge. Blood ran quick and hot, dripping onto the stone. I ripped a strip from a shirt sleeve and wrapped it tight, but the sight of it rattled me. I reached the bottom trembling and exhausted. The gorge was damp and shadowed, the air cooler but heavy with the smell of moss and wet stone. The stream flowed deeper here, slower, darker. I followed it, each step echoing in the narrow space. I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. That night, I camped in the gorge. I had been planning a solo hiking trip for weeks. The idea of leaving behind the noise of the city and going out into the quiet of the mountains sounded perfect. I picked a range that wasn't far from home, but still remote enough that I could walk for hours without running into another person. It was late summer, the days were long, and the weather forecast promised clear skies with only a small chance of rain. I thought it would be the perfect chance to push myself a little, hike further than usual, and maybe even camp overnight near one of the ridgelines before looping back the next day. I packed light but careful. I had my backpack with food, a water filter, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, and my knife. I had my boots broken in, and I carried a paper map with a compass even though I had a GPS on my phone. I told myself I was prepared. The trail I chose wasn't one of the popular ones. It was narrow with switchbacks, and it cut through thick woods before climbing up into exposed rock areas. I had read a little about it online, and most people said it was beautiful but lonely. That was what drew me in. The first few miles went smoothly. The forest was alive with birds, and the air was damp but fresh. Sunlight broke through the branches in sharp beams, and the ground was soft with old pine needles. I kept a steady pace, stopping now and then to drink water and check my map. The trail was well marked in the beginning, with bright blazes on the trees, and I didn't think much about getting lost. After about 3 hours of hiking, the trail grew steeper. The trees thinned, and the ground turned rocky. I had to use my hands sometimes to climb over larger stones, and my legs started to burn from the constant uphill push. I liked the feeling, though. It made me focus only on the climb and my breathing. By early afternoon, I reached a ridge with a wide view of the valley below. I could see layers of trees stretching into the distance, their tops moving with the wind. I sat there for a while, eating a granola bar and drinking from my bottle. The air was cooler at that height, and the silence pressed in heavier. I hadn't seen another person since I started, and that gave me a mix of peace and unease. I told myself I was fine, that this was exactly why I came out here. When I started moving again, I noticed the trail wasn't as clear. The blazes on the trees were fewer, and the ground was covered with loose rocks and fallen branches. I checked my map, tracing the line with my finger, and it looked like the path was supposed to loop around the ridge and then cut back down before rising again to a higher point. I followed what I thought was the trail, stepping carefully. An hour later, I realized the path I was on was barely a path at all. It narrowed into a thin ledge along the side of the ridge, with a steep drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. My stomach tightened. I knew some trails had sections like this, but something about it didn't feel right. I checked my GPS, and it showed me a little off from the official line. I figured I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere when the markings thinned out. Turning back would have been smart, but I kept thinking that the path might reconnect ahead. The idea of retracing all my steps down the ridge felt worse than just pressing on a little further. So I tightened the straps of my backpack and moved forward slowly. The ledge was narrow enough that I had to press one hand against the rock wall for balance. Loose gravel shifted under my boots with every step, and the drop to my left looked endless. My heart pounded harder than it had all day. I kept my eyes on my feet, placing them carefully, telling myself not to look at the edge. The sound of small stones skittering down the slope whenever I shifted made my skin crawl. After about 15 minutes, the ledge bent around the ridge and seemed to widen slightly. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last. When I came around the bend, the ledge ended in a washout. A chunk of the trail had collapsed, leaving only a few jagged rocks jutting out before nothing but air. Across the gap, maybe 10 feet away, the ledge continued. My stomach dropped. I stood there staring at it, my brain racing through bad ideas. I couldn't jump it. The gap was too wide, and if I missed, it would be the end. I couldn't climb up or down either. The wall above me was sheer rock, and below me was the steep slope that went down into trees so far below they looked like moss. My only real option was to go back. Turning around on that narrow ledge was harder than I expected. My backpack shifted whenever I moved, pulling me slightly toward the edge, and I had to lean into the wall just to steady myself. By the time I started making my way back, my legs felt shaky. The ground seemed looser than before, or maybe it was just that I was paying more attention. Halfway back, I heard a sound behind me. At first, I thought it was just more gravel falling, but it kept going, something sliding down the slope. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head and looked over my shoulder. A few rocks were rolling down the drop, dislodged from somewhere above. My first thought was that an animal might have moved through the rocks higher up. A deer, maybe, or something smaller. I stood still for a long moment, listening. The slope was quiet again, only the wind moving through the trees far below. I tried to calm myself, but my nerves were tight. I focused back on my steps, moving inch by inch along the ledge. When I finally reached the point where the trail widened into safer ground, I felt my knees nearly give out with relief. I moved quickly back into the thicker trees, breathing hard. My shirt clung to my back with sweat. I pulled out my map again and checked my GPS more carefully this time. I realized I had followed a faint animal path or an old cutoff trail instead of the marked one. The real trail was about half a mile to the east, deeper in the woods. I decided then to set up camp before it got too late. The sun was still a couple of hours from setting, but I didn't want to risk more mistakes while tired. I found a flat area under some trees, cleared away sticks, and set up my small tent. I boiled some water, made a quick meal, and sat there as the woods grew darker around me. The sounds of the forest changed as night came. Birds went quiet, and crickets and frogs took over. The air grew cooler, and I could smell damp earth and pine sap. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the image of that narrow ledge and the rocks sliding down behind me. I slept lightly, waking often to the noises outside. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me tense. At one point, I thought I heard movement close to the tent, slow steps pressing on dry leaves. I held my breath, gripping my knife inside the sleeping bag, but after a few minutes the sound faded. When morning came, I packed up quickly. I wanted to find the real trail and get back on track as soon as possible. The woods looked different in daylight, less threatening, but I still felt the knot of unease in my chest. I checked my compass, picked a direction east, and started moving. The terrain was rough, with thick brush and fallen logs, and I had to push through slowly. My arms were scratched, and sweat ran into my eyes. After what felt like forever, I spotted a blaze of paint on a tree. Relief hit me hard. I walked faster until I reached the proper trail again. The rest of the hike was calmer, but the memory of that narrow ledge stayed with me. I realized how easy it was to make a small mistake out here, how quickly things could turn dangerous with no one else around. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, my legs ached and my body was drained, but I was grateful just to be back on solid ground. When I got home, I looked at the map again and traced the spot where I had gone wrong. That faint path wasn't marked at all. Maybe it had been an old section of trail years ago, or maybe it was just where animals had worn down the ground. Either way, it was a reminder that even a small wrong turn in the mountains can put you in real danger. I thought about how easily the ledge could have given way under me, how one wrong step could have sent me tumbling down the slope. I knew then that I had been lucky. From that day on, I promised myself I'd never let overconfidence push me forward when I wasn't sure of the path. Hiking alone had always felt like freedom to me, but I learned the hard way that freedom comes with risk, and the mountains don't forgive mistakes. I had planned the hike for months. The trail wasn't famous, not the type you see in glossy magazines or popular travel blogs, but that was the reason I wanted it. I was tired of crowded paths and noisy campgrounds. I wanted silence. I wanted to push myself to get far away from everything and to be alone with the mountains. I had been through plenty of hikes before, weekend trips, week-long stretches, but this one was different. The route was longer, the terrain harsher, and the maps I found online warned about sections that weren't maintained anymore. That didn't scare me, it pulled me in. I parked my car near a ranger station early in the morning. The sun was just climbing over the horizon, and the air was crisp enough to sting my lungs with every breath. I loaded up my pack, heavy with food, water, gear, and an emergency kit that I thought I would never need. I had planned for 5 days on the trail, with 1 extra day's worth of supplies just in case. I checked my boots, laced them tight, and started walking. The first part of the hike was calm. The path wound through pine trees, and the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt and rocks was steady, almost rhythmic. Birds darted overhead, and every now and then, I stopped to adjust my pack or sip water. Hours slipped by, and the trail gradually grew steeper, leading me higher into the mountains. I felt good, strong, steady, and confident. By midday, I reached a clearing where I sat down for lunch. I pulled out a sandwich I had wrapped at home, chewed slowly, and watched the valley below. Clouds were gathering on the horizon, but they looked far off. The wind carried a faint chill, but nothing serious. I packed up again and pressed forward. The path began to change as the day went on. It narrowed, the dirt giving way to loose gravel that shifted under my boots. My calves burned as I climbed switchbacks that cut across the side of a steep slope. The trees thinned out, replaced by boulders and low shrubs. When I finally reached a ridge, I could see miles in every direction. Rolling hills, jagged peaks, and deep ravines. Felt like standing at the edge of the world. I set up camp just below the ridge that evening. I found a small flat spot sheltered by rocks, cleared it of sharp stones, and pitched my tent. The wind howled above me, but down in my little pocket, it was calm enough. I boiled water on my small stove, ate a packet of dehydrated food, and watched the sky turn from orange to purple to black. Stars filled the sky, bright and sharp, with no city lights to drown them out. I crawled into my sleeping bag that night with a sense of peace. The next day, everything began to shift. The trail grew harder to follow. Grass and weeds swallowed parts of it, and fallen branches forced me to climb or crawl around. At one point, the path forked in two, though my map showed only a single line. I stood there for a while, trying to judge which side looked more used, but both looked equally neglected. I chose the left, telling myself I could always backtrack if it was wrong. By afternoon, I was sure I had gone off the official trail. The ground sloped downward in strange angles, and instead of trail markers, I found nothing but animal tracks. I wasn't lost exactly. I had a compass, GPS, and map, but I was no longer on the route I had planned. Still, I pressed on, convinced that it would connect back eventually. Hours later, I realized my mistake. The ground beneath me became unstable, a mixture of mud and loose rock. My boots slipped more than once, and I had to use my trekking poles just to keep from sliding downhill. Worse, the trees grew denser, blocking out my view of the sky. I checked my GPS, but the device kept losing signal under the thick canopy. I told myself it was fine. I had food, water, and gear. I just needed to reorient and find the main path again. I climbed upward, thinking the higher ground would help. It was grueling. My pack seemed heavier, sweat soaked my shirt, and my legs ached with every step. When I finally broke through the trees onto another ridge, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. The wind was stronger now, carrying a sharp bite that made me shiver. I scanned the land around me, hoping to spot a trail marker, but I saw nothing, just endless slopes, cliffs, and valleys. For the first time, I felt uneasy. I set my pack down, drank water, and forced myself to breathe slowly. I told myself I wasn't in danger yet, but the thought of being truly alone out there crept in, sticking to me like the cold. That night, I camped again, though not on level ground. The spot I chose was tilted, rocky, and exposed. The wind battered my tent, making the fabric snap and groan all night long. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I woke again, disoriented and cold. The sound of branches scratching against each other in the wind made me feel like something was moving just outside. My nerves didn't settle. The next morning, the sky broke open with rain. Cold, hard drops soaked through my jacket within minutes. The ground turned slick, mud clinging to my boots, pulling me down. The map became nearly useless as the ink blurred from the water, and my GPS died after being exposed to the wet. I cursed myself for not sealing it better. I still had a compass, but it felt like a relic in a world that was swallowing me whole. I pushed forward, moving slower and slower as the rain fell. My clothes were heavy, my hands numb. At one point, I slipped on a wet rock and landed hard on my side. My hip took the brunt of it, sending pain shooting up my body. I lay there for a while, gasping before I forced myself back onto my feet. The idea of turning back had crossed my mind, but the problem was I didn't know which way back was anymore. The ridge I followed narrowed into a knife edge. To my left, the land dropped steeply into a valley filled with trees. To my right, cliffs rose high, wet and dark from the rain. The path was barely wide enough for my boots. Every step had to be deliberate. My heart pounded, and I couldn't shake the fear that one slip would send me tumbling into the void. Hours bled together like that. By the time the rain finally stopped, the world was cloaked in mist. Thick, heavy fog rolled in, hiding everything beyond a few feet. I could barely see the ground ahead of me, let alone any landmarks. I felt trapped in a gray bubble, each step a guess. I began to ration food. My hands shook as I measured out small handfuls of trail mix, forcing myself not to eat more. My water supply was dwindling too, though the rain gave me a chance to refill by setting out my bottles. It wasn't enough to feel secure. That night, I barely managed to set up my tent on uneven ground. The fog pressed in close, muffling sound, making the silence too deep. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sound of my own breathing, every crack of a branch outside making my stomach twist. My mind kept going back to how no one knew exactly where I was. If I didn't get back soon, no one would know where to look. The following day, I descended into the valley, thinking it would lead me back to water or maybe a connecting path. The ground was treacherous, covered in wet leaves and loose soil. I slid more than I walked, my arms constantly reaching for branches to steady myself. When I finally reached the bottom, I found a stream trickling through. Relief washed over me, and I drank greedily, though the water tasted of dirt and leaves. I followed the stream for hours, hoping it would lead me towards civilization. Instead, it led me deeper into a tangled forest where the sun barely reached the ground. The silence grew heavier there. No birds, no animals, just the sound of water and my own movements. The hair on my neck prickled. By evening, exhaustion pressed down on me so hard I could barely lift my legs. I made camp beside the stream, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest seemed to watch me. The silence was so complete it felt unnatural, but I told myself it was just my nerves. On the fourth day, I woke up weaker, my muscles stiff and sore. I forced myself to eat a small portion, though my stomach growled for more. I was running low and I knew it. My pack felt like an anchor, yet I couldn't leave anything behind. Every item felt like it could mean survival. I trudged on, following the stream until it split into two smaller trickles. I chose one at random, and after hours of climbing over fallen logs and pushing through thorny brush, I realized I had gone the wrong way. My body screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't. I needed to keep moving. By that evening, my boots were falling apart. The wet and constant pressure had torn the seams, and the soles were beginning to peel. My feet were raw, blistered, and bloody in places. Every step felt like fire. That night, as I lay in my tent, I admitted to myself that I was in serious danger. My food was nearly gone, my body was breaking down, and I had no clear path out. The thought of dying out there, alone, in a place no one even knew existed, wrapped itself around me like the cold. I had been planning that hiking trip for months. I had gone on hikes before, but most of them were short, easy trails close to towns or places where you could always hear the faint sound of cars somewhere in the distance. This time I wanted something different, something more isolated, a place where I could walk for hours and not run into anyone else. I read through guidebooks and online forums and kept coming across the same suggestion. An old mountain trail in a national forest that stretched for miles, cutting through ridges, valleys, and thick woods. The descriptions said it was rough and narrow in parts, but the views were incredible. That was what convinced me. I told myself it would be a challenge but manageable if I stayed focused. I started early in the morning, long before the sun had risen high enough to burn away the chill. My backpack was heavy on my shoulders, filled with water, food, a small first aid kit, and an emergency blanket just in case. I had strapped my sleeping bag to the bottom of the pack even though I hadn't fully decided whether I would camp or head back before dark. I wanted to give myself the option, because I knew there was always the chance I might get tired halfway through and prefer to stop rather than turn back. The trailhead was marked by a faded wooden sign. The parking lot was nearly empty, just one other car parked on the far side, which made me think there might be someone else already on the trail. I adjusted the straps on my pack, checked the laces on my boots, and started walking. At first, the path was wide and clear, dirt packed down by years of use. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the forest around me was so quiet that even the crunch of gravel under my feet sounded loud. As I went farther, the trail narrowed. Tree roots knuckled up through the ground, and I had to watch my footing. Every now and then I stopped to sip water and listen. I couldn't hear cars or voices, only the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional call of a bird. I liked that. It was the kind of silence I had been hoping for, the kind that makes you feel far away from everything else. After about 2 hours, I reached a ridge that opened up into a view of the valley below. The land rolled out in waves of dark green forest, with no towns or roads visible anywhere. It gave me a strange feeling, a mix of freedom and unease, like standing on the edge of something that could swallow me whole if I wasn't careful. I ate a granola bar, looked out for a while, then went back on the trail. From there, the path became steeper. It clung to the side of the ridge, a narrow cut barely wide enough for a person to walk without brushing against the slope. On one side was a drop that seemed to go down forever, and on the other side was the steep wall of the ridge itself. I kept close to the inside edge and moved slowly, planting each step firmly. My legs started to burn from the constant climb, and sweat ran down my back despite the cool air. At one point, I came across a section where the trail had partly collapsed, leaving only a sliver of dirt and rock that sloped downward. I crouched low, set my pack against the ridge for balance, and moved across inch by inch until I was back on steady ground. My heart was pounding hard by the time I crossed. I thought about turning back then, but I told myself I had already come this far and it would feel like failure if I quit. Hours went by like that. The trail twisted along the ridge, sometimes dipping into small pockets of trees, sometimes opening to exposed rock faces where the wind whipped hard against me. I drank water more often and rationed my food, telling myself I needed to keep enough for the return. The sky above stayed bright, but I knew that daylight could vanish faster than expected in the woods, and I kept checking my watch to track the time. By late afternoon, I reached another narrow stretch where the ridge cut sharp against the valley. This section was worse than the others. The path was uneven, chunks of rock scattered across it, and in some places it was barely wide enough for my boots. I crouched again to stay balanced, hugging the ridge with one shoulder and inching along. Halfway across, my foot slipped on loose gravel. My body lurched toward the drop, and for a second I felt the weight of my pack pulling me downward. I slammed my hand against the dirt wall and clung there, heart racing, until I steadied myself. I stood there for a long time after that, breathing hard, staring at the empty air just a step away. The thought of falling and tumbling down into the trees below left me shaky. My legs didn't feel steady, but I forced myself to keep moving because going back across the same section felt even worse. By the time I got to solid ground again, my hands were scraped from clutching at the ridge, and I could feel blisters forming on my heels. I told myself I should start looking for a place to set up camp. The idea of trying to cross another narrow section in the dark was out of the question. I walked until I found a small clearing where the trail widened slightly and there was enough flat ground to roll out my sleeping bag. The clearing wasn't large, just enough space to stand comfortably without feeling pressed against the ridge, but it was the best option I had. I set my pack down, stretched my sore shoulders, and ate another granola bar with a few gulps of water. The sun was beginning to dip lower, spilling orange light across the tops of the trees in the distance. I unrolled my sleeping bag and laid it out. As I worked, I kept feeling the sense that I was being watched. It was probably just the isolation, the way the silence pressed down harder as the day ended, but I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. When night fell, the temperature dropped fast. I slid into the sleeping bag, pulled it tight around me, and tried to relax. The forest was alive with sounds I hadn't noticed during the day. The crack of branches, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant call of an animal. Every noise made me tense. I knew there were bears and mountain lions in the area, even if sightings were rare. I gripped my pocket knife, keeping it close to my chest, even though I knew it wouldn't be much use against something larger than me. I didn't sleep well. I kept drifting off, then waking with a jolt whenever I heard a sound too close. At one point in the middle of the night, I heard something heavy moving in the brush near the trail. I lay completely still, holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound lingered for a while, then faded into the distance. I told myself it was probably a deer, but my mind kept circling back to worse possibilities. By dawn, my nerves were frayed. The first gray light pushed through the trees, and I wasted no time packing up. My stomach was tight from nerves, but I forced down a protein bar and drank as much water as I could. I wanted to get moving quickly before the sun rose higher. My plan was to push farther along the trail until midday, then turn around and head back with plenty of daylight left. The morning hike started better than I expected. My body felt stiff but stronger after resting, and I moved at a steady pace. The air was cold, but it kept me awake and alert. Still, as I advanced, the trail grew more unforgiving. At one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree, balancing carefully so I didn't slip. In another place, the trail narrowed to the point where my boots barely fit side by side, with the drop yawning just a step away. Then I reached a section that stopped me cold. The trail simply wasn't there anymore. A landslide had torn it away, leaving a scar of loose rock and dirt sloping down the side of the ridge. Across the gap, maybe 30 feet away, I could see where the trail picked back up. But between me and that point was nothing but unstable debris. The slope looked steep enough that one wrong step would send me sliding down into the valley. I stood there, staring at it, debating whether to try crossing or to turn back. Crossing felt reckless, but turning back meant retracing every narrow section I had already barely survived, and I knew how much time it would take. I shifted my pack, testing the weight, and my heart sank. It felt heavier than ever, like it was pulling me toward the drop with every step. In the end, I decided I had no choice but to try. I crouched low, dug my boots into the dirt, and moved slowly onto the broken slope. Each step sent small rocks sliding out from under me. I tried to keep my body pressed close to the ridge for balance, grabbing at roots and small outcroppings to steady myself. My breath came fast and shallow. I didn't dare look down. Halfway across, the ground gave way under my left foot. I dropped to my hands and knees, sliding a few feet before I managed to dig my boot into a root and stop. Dirt and rocks tumbled past me into the valley. My chest was heaving, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the root. I lay there for a long moment, trying to summon the strength to move again. Finally, inch by inch, I crawled forward until I reached the other side. When I stepped back onto solid trail, I collapsed against the ridge, shaking, my body covered in sweat despite the cold. I stayed there for nearly half an hour, drinking water, forcing myself to eat a little and trying to calm down. The rest of the day passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. Every narrow section felt worse than before. Every rustle in the woods made me think of predators, and my legs felt weaker with each step. I realized at some point that I hadn't seen another person since I started. The thought of twisting an ankle or running out of water out there made my stomach clench. By late afternoon, I knew I had been looking forward to that hike for weeks. The idea had come to me during one of those late nights when I was stuck staring at a screen for too long, feeling restless and tired of the usual routine. I wanted to push myself a little, get far away from the noise, and spend a couple of days out in nature without the interruptions of phones, people, or city life. I chose a trail that wasn't too well known, but it had some good reviews from hikers online who said it was beautiful but challenging. That was exactly what I wanted. The plan was simple. I would drive out early in the morning, park at the small trailhead, hike most of the first day, set up camp somewhere off the path, then make it to the end by the second day. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous, at least not on paper. The trail wasn't marked as one of those extreme ones. It was just long and cut through a mix of dense forest, rocky ridges, and valleys with streams. I packed my gear carefully. Sleeping bag, lightweight tent, water filter, enough food for 2 days plus extra snacks, a headlamp, first aid kit, and a knife. I had checked everything twice. The morning I left, the weather was cool, with low clouds hanging over the hills. I drove down long winding roads until I reached the small gravel lot that served as the parking spot for the trailhead. There were only 2 other cars there, both dusty like they had been sitting for at least a day. That meant I might see other people out there, but it wasn't crowded. I liked that. The first hour of the hike was almost peaceful. The path was clear, soft dirt mixed with roots, and the air smelled of pine. My backpack felt heavy but manageable. I stopped a few times to adjust the straps and sip water. The forest around me was thick but not dark. There were birds calling, small animals rustling, and the faint sound of water somewhere downhill. As I got deeper, the trail began to climb. The trees thinned a little, replaced by rocks and patches of open ground where I could see across the hills. The views were beautiful. I could see rolling ridges one after another fading into the distance. The ground was damp in spots, and I had to step carefully to avoid slipping. I kept a steady pace, not pushing too hard but not slowing down too much either. By midday, I stopped for a break on a flat rock. I ate a protein bar and let my legs rest. The silence out there was different. Even when the wind moved the trees, it felt heavier somehow. I tried to remind myself that was part of what I wanted. No cars, no voices, no constant buzzing of electronics. Just space. After the break, the trail changed. It narrowed and the soil turned loose. The slope on one side dropped sharply, and I had to keep my eyes on where I placed my boots. I slipped once and caught myself on a branch. My heart raced for a moment, and I reminded myself not to get careless. It would be easy to twist an ankle or worse out there. Later in the afternoon, clouds began to gather overhead. They weren't dark storm clouds, but they covered the sun and made the woods dim. I checked my watch and realized I had already been moving longer than I thought. My plan had been to hike until about an hour before sunset and then set up camp. I started scanning for flat spots where I could put up the tent. That's when I noticed something strange. The trail markers, small painted blazes on trees, seemed to get harder to find. I had seen them regularly all morning, but now I would go long stretches without one, then suddenly see one far up ahead. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe this part of the trail just wasn't maintained as well. Still, I started paying closer attention. I finally found a small clearing off the path with ground that was mostly level. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. I set my pack down and began setting up the tent. My body was sore from the climb, and my stomach was rumbling, so I wanted camp ready before I lost the light. I managed to get everything in place. Tent up, sleeping bag unrolled, food bag hung on a tree branch a short distance away. I sat inside the tent for a while, eating some trail mix and jerky, listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest grew very quiet as the evening came. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by the occasional crack of branches far off. I felt uneasy for a reason I couldn't explain. I kept checking the zipper of my tent, making sure it was closed tight. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up to every little noise outside. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, something moving in the brush. My mind kept picturing animals, deer maybe, or raccoons. I told myself it was nothing unusual. When I finally drifted into deeper sleep, I woke again in the middle of the night to silence. Not a single sound. No wind, no insects, just silence. My heart pounded, and I lay still, staring at the roof of the tent. I didn't hear footsteps or breathing, but the stillness was worse than noise. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back asleep. The next morning, I packed up and returned to the trail. The ground was damp from a light rain overnight, and my boots sank into the soil. I kept moving, but something was wrong. The path seemed less clear than it had been. Grass and weeds were growing through it in patches, and the blazes on trees were even more spaced out. I started to worry that maybe I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, but I couldn't remember seeing any split in the trail. I kept going, hoping it would become clearer again. Instead, it grew rougher. Fallen trees blocked sections, forcing me to climb over or around. At one point, I stopped and pulled out the folded map I had brought. It wasn't very detailed, just a general outline of the trail. It was hard to tell exactly where I was on it. The forest around me looked the same in every direction. Hours passed, and I felt like I was going in circles, even though I stayed on what seemed like a path. I hadn't seen another person since I started. My water supply was holding up because I had the filter, but my nerves were wearing thin. Every little noise in the woods put me on edge. I kept turning my head, scanning behind me, even though I knew there was nothing there. By mid-afternoon, I realized something I had been trying not to admit. The trail wasn't the real trail anymore. I had somehow wandered onto an old path or animal track. That explained the faintness of it, the lack of markers, the overgrowth. My chest tightened as I thought about it. If I kept following it, I could be going deeper into the woods instead of closer to the exit. I tried backtracking, but it was nearly impossible. The ground looked the same and my boot prints were faint. I kept second-guessing every turn I made. The forest pressed in, dense and endless. The light was already starting to fade again, and I knew I couldn't afford to wander in the dark. I chose a spot near a stream to camp, telling myself I'd figure it out in the morning. I filtered water, forced myself to eat, and crawled into the tent. But that night was worse. I heard movement outside, slow, heavy steps in the leaves. My breath caught and I froze. The steps came closer, then paused. I gripped the knife in my sleeping bag, my hand shaking. After what felt like forever, the sound faded. I stayed awake most of the night, straining to hear if it returned. The next day, I tried heading uphill, thinking I could find a ridge and get a view of where I was. The climb was brutal. My legs burned, and sweat soaked my shirt. When I finally reached the top, all I saw were more ridges and valleys stretching endlessly. No signs of roads, no houses, nothing but forest. My stomach sank. I realized then just how badly things had turned. I was off trail, alone, and running out of energy. I forced myself to keep moving, marking trees with small cuts from my knife so I wouldn't circle back by mistake. I rationed my food, eating less than I wanted. The woods seemed to grow darker each day, even in daylight. I felt watched, even though I knew it was just my nerves. Every sound made me twitch, the snap of a branch, the sudden scatter of small animals, the wind moaning through the trees. My body grew sore, my ankles stiff, and my shoulders ached from the pack. By the fourth day, I was exhausted. My food was nearly gone, and the constant alertness was wearing me down. I found a muddy clearing where tracks crisscrossed, deer maybe or something larger. I didn't linger. I kept pushing, trying to find anything that looked like human presence. Late in the afternoon, I finally saw something that made my heart leap, a faint line of tire tracks in the mud. They were old and shallow, but they were human. I followed them, stumbling through brush, tripping over roots, desperate not to lose the trail. The tracks wound downhill, and eventually, I heard the faint rush of water. I reached a wide stream, and across it was a dirt road. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly buckled. I waded through the cold water and scrambled up onto the road. It was rough and narrow, but it was something. I followed it for hours until the trees opened, and I saw a small cabin with smoke rising from a chimney. When I finally reached it, my legs were trembling. The door opened, and a man stepped out, surprised to see me. He wasn't threatening, just shocked that I had stumbled out of the woods looking. I have always loved hiking, and for years it felt like something that gave me peace when life became too heavy. I liked the quiet, the way the air smelled cleaner when you got far enough away from towns, and the sense that the ground under my boots belonged to no one. That feeling of being cut off from everything, but still safe because nature felt like an old friend, was what drew me back again and again. But after one particular trip, my view of hiking changed forever. I still hike sometimes, but I don't go out alone the way I used to. I learned the hard way that being deep in the woods with no one around can be just as dangerous as it is peaceful. It started with a simple plan. I wanted to spend 2 days hiking through a section of trail I hadn't done before, stay overnight at a small backcountry site, and then hike back out the next day. I had done longer trips, and I felt like this one would be nothing unusual. I packed my gear carefully the night before. My bag was loaded with my tent, a sleeping bag, a pad, food for 2 days, extra layers, a small cooking pot, water bottles, and a filter. I also carried my knife, a headlamp, and a first aid kit. Everything felt routine, the same way I had packed dozens of times before. The morning of the hike was calm. The sky was clear with only a few thin clouds stretched across it, and the air was cool enough that I felt comfortable starting out in a long-sleeve shirt. I parked at the trailhead, locked the car, and slung the pack over my shoulders. The straps dug in the familiar way, heavy but manageable. I took my first steps down the trail, feeling that mix of excitement and calm that I always felt at the start. The trail wound through tall trees, their leaves shifting slightly in the breeze. The dirt underfoot was soft and mixed with pine needles. Birds called out in the canopy, and I could hear the faint rush of a creek somewhere off to the right. The sun filtered through in patches, breaking up the shade with bright pieces of light. Everything felt ordinary, like hundreds of hikes I had done before. I made good time for the first couple of hours, stopping now and then to sip water or adjust my pack straps. The trail slowly climbed, and my legs warmed up to the rhythm. I liked the steady motion of walking uphill, the feeling of breathing harder but pushing through it. Sweat started to collect at my temples, but the air was cool enough that it dried quickly. I passed through a section where the trees thinned and the trail crossed over a rocky slope. From there, I could see ridges stretching off into the distance, layers of green fading into blue. By early afternoon, I had covered close to 10 miles. I stopped to eat a late lunch, sitting on a fallen log just off the trail. I chewed slowly, listening to the silence between the occasional bird calls. It was always striking how quiet the woods could become when the breeze stopped and the animals held still. I ate my sandwich, some trail mix, and an apple, then rested for a while longer before pushing on. The trail eventually began to narrow, and the trees closed in again. I knew the backcountry site I was heading to wasn't far now, maybe 2 more miles at most. The path curved down into a hollow where the ground was damp and covered in ferns. I could smell the wet soil, and the air felt cooler in the shaded dip. I checked the map, reassured myself that I was on track, and kept walking. When I finally reached the small clearing marked as the site, I felt relieved. My shoulders ached from the pack, and my legs had that tired but strong feeling that comes after a full day of hiking. The site was just a flat piece of ground near a small stream, with enough space for 1 or 2 tents. No one else was there, which didn't surprise me. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and started setting up camp. I cleared away a few sticks and rocks, laid down my ground sheet, and pitched the tent. After that, I filled my bottles from the stream and filtered the water. The sun was starting to sink lower, and the light took on that golden color that always makes the forest feel calm. I cooked a small meal on my stove, ate slowly, and cleaned up carefully, making sure to store my food properly away from camp. I had done all of this so many times it felt like muscle memory. As the evening deepened, the woods around me grew quieter. The birds that had been calling earlier fell silent, and the steady background hum of insects took over. I sat for a while outside the tent, listening to the stream and watching the last light fade from the trees. When the shadows stretched too far, I turned on my headlamp, crawled into the tent, and slid into my sleeping bag. It took me a while to fall asleep. The ground was uneven, and I shifted a few times to get comfortable. But eventually the steady sound of the stream lulled me, and I drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I first woke up, but it was still dark outside. The woods were completely silent. Not even insects seemed to be making noise, which struck me as strange. I lay there, listening, my heart beating a little faster than before. Then I heard it, faint crunching sounds like footsteps on leaves. At first I thought it might be an animal. Deer were common in these woods, and it wouldn't have surprised me to hear one moving nearby. But the pattern of the sound was steady, and it didn't match the quick, sharp steps of a deer. It sounded slower, more deliberate. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to listen. The crunching came closer, then paused. My chest felt tight. I told myself it could be anything, a raccoon, maybe even just branches falling. But deep down, I knew it sounded like a person. Minutes passed in silence, and I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Then the sound came again, this time even closer, just outside the edge of the clearing. My skin prickled. Whoever or whatever it was seemed to be circling the area. I didn't move, afraid the noise would give away my position, though the tent itself made it obvious someone was there. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours, my ears straining for every little sound. Eventually, the crunching faded, growing more distant until it disappeared altogether. I forced myself to breathe again, trying to slow the pounding in my chest. Sleep didn't come easily after that. I lay awake, eyes open in the dark, until exhaustion finally pulled me under. When the faint light of morning filtered through the tent fabric, I felt a wave of relief. I unzipped the door and stepped outside, looking around carefully. The clearing looked the same as before. No signs of anything unusual. No footprints I could see, though the ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, which made tracking difficult. Still, I couldn't shake the memory of that sound. I ate a quick breakfast, packed up camp, and decided to cut the trip shorter than planned. I wanted to head back out rather than stay another night. The trail was long, but I knew I could push myself to cover the distance in a day if I kept moving steadily. As I hiked, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. Every sound in the woods made me tense. A squirrel darting through the underbrush, a branch snapping somewhere deeper in the trees. Each one set my nerves on edge. My pack felt heavier than before, and my steps were quicker, almost rushed. Hours passed, and I forced myself to focus on the trail ahead, marking familiar landmarks. But at one point, when the path curved through another dense section of forest, I thought I caught sight of movement behind me, a shadow between the trees. When I stopped to look, there was nothing there. I kept walking, but unease built in my stomach. The trail felt longer than it had on the way in, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't until later in the afternoon that the unease turned into fear. I had stopped briefly to drink water, standing still with my pack resting against a tree. That was when I heard it again, the crunch of footsteps. This time it was unmistakable. Slow, steady, matching the rhythm of a person walking. I froze, staring back down the trail. At first there was nothing. Then, far off between the trees, I saw the faint outline of someone. They were standing still, half hidden by the shadows. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it wasn't just my imagination. A cold rush went through me. My first instinct was to call out, but something in me resisted. If it was another hiker, why were they hanging back like that? Why not just pass me on the trail? I grabbed my pack, swung it onto my shoulders, and started moving quickly. I didn't run, but my pace was fast enough that my legs burned. I checked behind me every few minutes, but the figure never seemed close when I looked. Still, I could hear it now and then, the crunch of steps behind me not matching mine, always a beat behind. The sun was starting to sink again, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. My breathing was sharp and fast, and my mind kept racing with thoughts I didn't want to admit to. I was too far in to turn back, and too far from the trailhead to feel safe yet. All I could do was keep moving forward. By the time I reached the last few miles, my legs were trembling with exhaustion. The weight of the pack felt unbearable. I forced myself to keep going, knowing that stopping wasn't an option anymore. The trail finally began to widen, and I saw the faint glimmer of light where the trees thinned near the parking area. When I broke out of the forest and saw my car waiting, I felt a surge